He was once untouchable, the man who made elite fighters look like amateurs. Anderson Silva ruled the UFC middleweight division with a mystique that felt supernatural. Fans called him the Spider because of how he moved, struck, and dismantled opponents without breaking a sweat. But then, it all came crashing down. A leg snapped in half on live TV, a failed drug test that shattered his credibility, a string of losses that dragged his name through the mud, and now, silent. No grand send-off, no legacy tour, just a legend quietly fading while the world moves on. His life now is a far cry from the glory days, and the most painful part is that nobody talks about him anymore. This is the tragic downfall of Anderson Silva, and why it still hurts to watch. Anderson Silva's journey to greatness started far from the bright lights of the UFC. He was born on April 14, 1975, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, into poverty so deep that he often relied on borrowed clothes and leftover food. Raised mostly by his aunt and uncle in a crowded household, Anderson's earliest years were shaped by scarcity, not opportunity. He didn't grow up thinking he'd be a champion. He grew up just trying to survive. But even in the favelas, there was something different about him. He wasn't aggressive like other boys. He was calculated, calm, watchful. When other kids were throwing punches, Anderson was studying movement, watching Bruce Lee movies frame by frame, copying the form in front of broken mirrors. With no money for training, he learned by mimicking. Eventually, his uncle scraped together enough to get him into taekwondo classes. Later, he added capoeira, jiu-jitsu, and Muay Thai. By the time he was in his 20s, he was already a master of motion. In 1997, he went professional. His early MMA fights were scattered across Brazil, sometimes for a few $100 and a handshake. The gloves were too big, the rings were makeshift, the rules loose. But Silva didn't care. He wasn't in it for the money. He was chasing something bigger, a dream of becoming more than just another poor kid from the slums. By the early 2000s, Silva had made it to Pride and Shuto in Japan, showcasing a style no one had seen before. He wasn't just striking, he was flowing, gliding, performing. He made violence look graceful. And even then, in places where submission grapplers dominated, Silva's striking shined like a diamond in the rough. But while Brazil and Japan saw his brilliance, America wasn't paying attention. The UFC, still developing, hadn't opened its arms to his kind of fighting yet. Wrestling and ground and pound were the name of the game. Silva was too flashy, too risky. At least, that's what they thought. All of that changed in 2006 when he finally got the call. Anderson Silva was coming to the UFC, and he wasn't coming to participate. He was coming to take over. Anderson Silva's UFC debut wasn't just impressive, it was prophetic. On June 28, 2006, he faced Chris Leben, a fan-favorite brawler with a chin of steel. The fight didn't make it to the 1-minute mark. Silva's pinpoint accuracy and terrifying calmness ended it in just 49 seconds. Elbows, knees, and a perfectly timed punch. It was like watching a master dismantle a machine. Fans weren't sure what they had just seen. Fighters usually eased into the UFC, but Silva walked in like he owned the cage. 2 months later, he faced middleweight champion Rich Franklin. Franklin was tough, skilled, respected, but Silva made him look like an amateur. He clinched Franklin and delivered knees so brutal that Franklin's face folded, his nose broken, his spirit crushed. The Anderson Silva era had officially begun. From that moment until 2012, Silva ruled the UFC middleweight division like a god. 10 straight title defenses, 17 consecutive wins, knockouts that defied logic, submissions out of nowhere. Opponents like Dan Henderson, Forrest Griffin, Chael Sonnen, and Vitor Belfort, none could solve the puzzle. Silva didn't just win, he humiliated. He turned elite fighters into highlight reels. His style was revolutionary. He fought with his hands down. He swayed inches away from punches. He smiled mid-fight. His front kick knockout of Belfort is still played in gyms across the world. One clean motion that sent a grown man unconscious in front of millions. Silva wasn't just fighting. fighting. He was performing. Fans compared him to Bruce Lee. Commentators called him Neo from The Matrix. It was as if Silva could see punches before they came. Dana White labeled him the greatest fighter of all time. Fighters started studying Silva like scripture. Analysts ran slow-motion replays, trying to decode what made him so effective. But there was no formula. Silva wasn't a system. He was an instinct, a feeling, a storm in slow motion. But with that brilliance came pressure. He was too good, too dominant. Fans no longer wondered if he'd win, but how he'd do it. The UFC needed him on every card. Sponsors lined up. His face appeared on posters, in ads, in movies. And slowly, beneath the calm surface, the burden of being invincible began to weigh on him. Behind the mask of perfection, cracks were starting to form. And when they split open, they would break everything. By the summer of 2013, Silva had beaten everyone. The UFC was running out of middleweights to throw at him. So they turned to a rising contender, Chris Weidman. Young, strong, underdog. Most fans thought it would be another Silva masterpiece. But Silva, for once, seemed distracted. When Anderson Silva returned to the UFC after the leg break, fans hoped for a miracle. But the reality was brutal. The comeback fight against Nick Diaz in 2015 was awkward, hesitant, and lacked the sparkle Silva once brought to the cage. Silva won by decision, but not decisively, and the victory was short-lived. Weeks later, the news broke that Silva had failed a drug test. 2 banned substances were found in his system, drostanolone and androsterone. It was the first time his reputation had ever been stained with the word cheater. Anderson blamed tainted supplements and treatment for sexual performance. The excuse made headlines, but few believed it. The Nevada State Athletic Commission handed him a 1-year suspension, and suddenly, the man once viewed as the most honorable artist in the Octagon was lumped in with PED users. It wasn't just the suspension, it was the damage to his legacy. His earlier dominance, his impossible reflexes, his unthinkable knockouts were now questioned. Had he always been using? Was it just age and desperation catching up with him? His fans were divided. The mystique was already fragile. Now, it was cracked wide open. Silva tried to push forward. He fought Michael Bisping in 2016 in a bout that became symbolic of the new Silva. Hesitant, reactive, inconsistent. In the 3rd round, Silva landed a flying knee that nearly knocked Bisping out, but confusion from the ref allowed the fight to continue. Bisping recovered and won on points. Once again, Silva's brilliance flashed for a moment, only to fade back into defeat. From there, the record turned depressing. Losses to Daniel Cormier, Jared Cannonier, and Israel Adesanya followed. Against Adesanya, his spiritual successor, the respect was mutual. But even in defeat, Silva looked like a ghost of his former self. No longer unpredictable, no longer dangerous, just a man fighting shadows of the past. The broken body was catching up with him. His timing was off. His chin wasn't the same. His legs, once his deadliest weapon, were now tentative. Each time Silva walked into the cage, it felt less like a triumph and more like a reminder of what we'd lost. The fans still clapped, but they weren't cheering a warrior anymore. They were mourning an era. By the time Silva finally left the UFC in 2020, he was 45 years old. His record in his last 9 UFC fights: 1 win, 7 losses, 1 no contest. It was painful to watch. The greatest striker of all time, now reduced to a journeyman. His timing was off, his movement slowed, and worst of all, he didn't seem to know when to quit. Dana White, who once called him the GOAT, practically begged him to stop fighting. After Silva's last loss to Uriah Hall, White said, "I shouldn't have let him fight. I made a big mistake. He's a legend, but tonight proved it's time." Silva didn't officially retire in the cage. There were no tears, no gloves left in the Octagon, just a vague Instagram post days later. No ceremony, no parade, no official UFC send-off. After everything Silva gave to the sport, after reshaping MMA with elegance and violence, the final chapter in the UFC ended with a whisper, not a roar. But Anderson wasn't ready to walk away. That's the tragedy. He turned to boxing, hoping to reclaim some relevance. In 2021, he fought Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. and shocked the world with a win. The movement was still there, the creativity, the timing. For one night, it felt like the old Silva had returned, but that joy didn't last. In 2022, 2022, Silva fought YouTuber-turned-boxer Jake Paul and lost. Not by knockout, but still, the optics were brutal. One of the most respected fighters in combat sports history had become a stepping stone for internet clout. That fight wasn't just about losing, it was about what Anderson Silva had become, a name fighters used to elevate their brand, a legend reduced to novelty. The man who once headlined UFC cards across the world was now being announced under flashing TikTok graphics. After the Jake Paul loss, Silva faded into the background. No major media runs, no trainer gigs, no coaching stints, just silence. The sport had moved on. New stars had taken over, and Silva, despite all he built, was largely forgotten by the machine he helped grow. Today, Anderson Silva's life is quiet, painfully quiet. He lives in California with his wife and children, staying out of the spotlight. Occasionally, he appears at martial arts events or posts nostalgic videos to Instagram, but there's no longer a crowd waiting. No UFC invitation, no ESPN interviews. The legend has become a ghost. Financially, he's not broke, but he's not rich either. Despite headlining some of the biggest events in UFC history, Silva's total career earnings from fighting are estimated to be under $20 million before taxes, manager cuts, and expenses. Compared to today's stars who land multi-million-dollar brand deals and post-fight bonuses, Silva's era was underpaid. His final few fights in the UFC barely drew pay-per-view numbers. The sport he helped globalize had become a business that no longer needed him. Silva's social media presence is modest. He occasionally promotes crypto sponsorships or fitness brands, but it's clear he doesn't have a long-term media strategy like some of his peers. He's not building a brand, he's just floating. There were talks of a biopic, a training academy, a podcast, but none of it materialized. And unlike other legends who transition into commentary roles or celebrity gigs, Silva lacks the charisma for mainstream broadcasting. His charm was always in his motion, not his mouth. Meanwhile, fans argue about his legacy online. Some say he's still the GOAT. Others discredit him for the drug test. But one thing is undeniable. Anderson Silva changed the sport forever. And now, that same sport has turned the page without him. The man who once made violence look like art is now sitting in the shadows, quietly watching a world he helped create, knowing it no longer has room for him. Behind the fighter, there's always a family. And in Anderson Silva's case, his home life has remained far more stable than the war zones he dominated. He's been married to his longtime partner, Diane Silva, for decades, and together they've raised 5 children, 3 sons, 2 daughters. While Silva rarely gives in-depth interviews about his family, glimpses into his private life reveal a man who adores his kids, even if he struggles to connect with them the way he once connected with fans. His sons, especially Gabriel and Kalil, have followed in his footsteps, training in striking and even stepping into the ring in amateur bouts. Anderson shows up, coaches them, stands quietly in their corners. But there's something heartbreaking in his posture. He cheers them on like a proud father, but it's clear that part of him is living vicariously through them, clinging to something he lost. A shadow of greatness cast onto a new generation. And it's not just about passing down skills, it's about rewriting his own ending. Anderson Silva doesn't talk about wanting his sons to be champions. He talks about wanting them to do it differently, to be remembered for who they are, not what they were. That's the part that stings. The Spider, the greatest middleweight in UFC history, doesn't see his career as a template. He sees it as a cautionary tale. He built a kingdom out of violence, but he's quietly begged his kids to build something softer, more lasting. That alone speaks volumes. The public may have moved on from Silva, but he hasn't moved on from the cage. He keeps training, keeps moving, keeps posting videos of pad work and shadow boxing, almost like he's talking to himself in the mirror. It's muscle memory, and maybe trauma. A man who gave everything to his craft, but was left with silence in return. And when the cameras aren't rolling, and his sons are back in school or training on their own, Silva is often alone, still disciplined, still in shape. But for what? That question haunts him, and everyone who still remembers what he used to be. You'd think a man like Anderson Silva would be living like a king. After all, he was the face of an empire during the UFC's most formative years. But Silva's lifestyle tells a different story. He owns a modest but beautiful home in Los Angeles, a sleek, modern property tucked away from the public. It's comfortable, not extravagant, a far cry from the sprawling estates owned by modern stars like Conor McGregor or Israel Adesanya. Inside, Silva's house reflects a man stuck between two worlds. The walls are covered in photos and memorabilia, snapshots of old victories, belts he no longer wears, fight posters from glory days. The decor is clean and modern, but there's an eerie stillness in the space, like a museum curated by someone who doesn't know whether to celebrate or mourn. His car collection, surprisingly reserved. A black Range Rover, a silver Mercedes-Benz, and an old-school motorcycle he rarely takes out anymore. There are no flashy Lamborghinis or custom builds screaming wealth. Silva never chased attention through materialism, and now that the money's slowed down, it shows. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Silva never landed a giant Hollywood breakout role. His acting cameos were short-lived, forgettable even. His endorsement deals, once strong with brands like Burger King in Brazil and Nike, vanished after the drug test scandal. The revenue dried up, the spotlight dimmed. His estimated net worth today? Around $8 million, a decent figure for most. But for a man who headlined dozens of pay-per-view events, shattered records, and helped define an entire sport, it's almost insulting. And worse, it's dwindling. The Jake Paul fight may have padded his pockets briefly, but no big checks are coming anymore. Silva hasn't embraced podcasting. He's not selling whiskey. He's not launching a clothing brand. He's just living quietly, aging, watching the younger generation build wealth on the fame foundation he helped pour. And when you realize how much he gave, how little he got, and how forgotten he's become, those houses and cars start to feel less like trophies and more like reminders of a system that used him up and moved on. Anderson Silva's story doesn't end with a triumphant farewell. It ends in silence, and that's what makes it truly tragic. In the years since his last UFC appearance, Silva has slipped into cultural invisibility. You don't hear fans chanting his name at events. His highlights are rarely shown unless it's Throwback Thursday. Fighters still respect him, sure, but the world has largely moved on. And when Silva does resurface, whether at a weigh-in, a gym, or a charity function, the response isn't electric. It's polite, distant. He's no longer the Spider. He's Anderson, a man who used to be something. That's the pain few talk about. Not the leg break, not the losses, not the failed test, but the emotional weight of being forgotten, of knowing that you once had the world's attention, and now you can barely get a podcast interview. Silva has spoken about depression, about loneliness, about trying to find peace after war. He's not bitter, at least not publicly, but you can see it in his eyes when he talks about his career. There's a sadness there, a knowing, a wound that no win can stitch up. Even his Hall of Fame induction, which many fans assumed would be a grand celebration, felt delayed, quiet. It wasn't broadcast with fireworks. It wasn't a global moment. It came years after his last fight, tucked away like an afterthought. What does it mean when the greatest striker in MMA history can't even get a proper goodbye? It means the sport has a memory problem. It means legacy fades faster than highlights. And it means that men like Anderson Silva, who bled for the Octagon, often leave it with nothing but scars. Today, he trains alone, teaches his sons, smiles on social media. But behind that smile is a man who gave everything and got far less than he deserved. And that's why Anderson Silva's life now is truly sad.